Okay, folk, the papers are coming due fairly soon. Anyway, sometime later this month. You might not realize we meet 29 times, and today is meeting number 15, which means that when this class is over with, the semester will be more than half over. So we're at the midpoint, all right. All right, we're at the midpoint of our book also. Chapter 16, Reconstruction. The Reconstruction period is the period of time from the end of the Civil War until President Rutherford B. Hayes, removed the last of the federal troops from the South. Reconstruction, according to Carl Schurz, he said that Reconstruction was a revolution half accomplished. You know, half accomplished. They had eliminated slavery, but the black man was still made a second-class citizen and was to remain so for more than 100 years. The opening vignette talks about Carl Schurz, yes, but it also talks about James Rapier. Before the Civil War, he fled to Canada to escape racial discrimination, believing that things would be better in Canada. They were, but he wanted to see the blacks treated equally in the United States. So when it became obvious that the Union was going to win, he went back to Alabama. The Union won. James Rapier tried to make Alabama a place where the blacks were treated equally with whites, and he found it impossible. Try as he might, he eventually began to fear for his life. He fled Alabama. I believe he went to Kansas. Your book will give more detail. But he only lived about 48 years and then picked up a disease and died of a disease without his dream coming true. Now, the Constitution had never foreseen a time when some states would leave the Union and then be forced back into the Union at gunpoint. So nobody knew who's responsible for putting the Union back together, the President or Congress. Well, even before he died, a lot of people became concerned because Lincoln was perceived to be too soft on the Confederate States. One of his last major speeches, he talked about with malice toward none, with charity for all. But Congress wanted to completely redo Southern society. Lincoln, now I've got here in my notes that Lincoln wanted to give some blacks the right to vote. I must state he also wanted to send some of them back to Africa. In fact, he wanted to send a majority of them back to Africa and only leave a few of the upper crust of the ones here. The problem with that was no African at this time wanted to go back to Africa. They had tried that a generation before, and the stronger Africans would sell the weaker Africans as slaves. So the Africans feared something similar happening if they went back to Africa, so they did not want to go back. Well, again, Lincoln had a plan. Lincoln did not live to carry it out. If Lincoln would have lived, he would have faced the problems that were passed on to the next president, and there's a chance that he might have been impeached even as the next president was. Because he was already in trouble for being too soft. But then he died, and his people elevated him. I mean, he died within a few days after Lee had surrendered to Grant. And his people elevated him on a pedestal and put him on a pedestal right next to George Washington. And he gets his picture on the penny, the $5 bill. He's gotten his picture on several postage stamps, and his statue appears in a lot of places. And he's got a memorial for him right there in Washington, a very, very prominent place in Washington, D.C. Not every president has. Washington has a monument, Jefferson has a memorial, Lincoln has a memorial, but a lot of them don't. Anyway, he didn't live to carry out his plan. Now, transitioning from a slave society to a society where slavery was illegal, that was not going to be easy for the South. Southerners felt that without the right to whip, blacks wouldn't work. The black people felt that, hey, without land, freedom from slavery is worthless. We have to be given land. And also at this time, well, about this time, in 1862, the Tsar of Russia had freed more than 1 million serfs. Serfs were practically slaves. But in Russia, the thing about Russia, Russia became ashamed of being the only country in Europe that still had serfdom. Serfdom was an old institution. It went back to the Middle Ages. And every place in Europe had ended serfdom except for Russia, and they became embarrassed about it. But when they freed their serfs, at least the Tsar saw to it that they had land. No, they were not given land. They were given what amounted to a 50-year loan, and they were given 50 years to pay for the land. But at least they were given land. Now, General Sherman, as he passed through particularly South Carolina and North Carolina, oops. You know, I already mentioned how that General Sherman went from Atlanta to Savannah and pulled up every railroad, destroyed every bridge, and burned everything in sight. Then he went to South Carolina, and he eventually got his way to North Carolina, and he was going to join forces with Grant, but the war ended before he got there. But he took land from the rich white landowners, the plantation owners, and gave blacks 40 acres and a mule. And the blacks believed that, hey, this is going to be the policy, the white man's going to give us 40 acres and a mule. This did not work. Did not work out. President Johnson, who took over after Lincoln, repudiated or did away with Sherman's plan. Anyway, when Lincoln was shot dead in April 1865, Congress was away. Johnson took the oath of office and then got together his own Reconstruction program. Now, Johnson had been a Southern Democrat. The only thing he disagreed with the Democrats on was he did not believe that states had the right to leave the Union. But other than the issue of secession, Johnson agreed with the Democrats. He had once been a slave owner himself and had freed his slaves only when he saw that it was becoming, well, that he pretty much had to. So he reluctantly freed his slaves, but he did not believe in any way in racial equality. When Congress returned from being off, Congress will take some time off to go home, when they returned, they put forth their own Reconstruction plan that was much more harsh than Johnson's was. Oh yes, Johnson even returned land that had been given to freed blacks. Johnson hated the rich, having grown up in poverty, yet when it came to a showdown, he gave them back their lands, so that in the South, a few people owned almost all the land, and the rest of the Southerners, including most whites, owned nothing. A lot of the congressmen rejected even Johnson's mild terms, not the Southerners. The Southern states began to draw up their own constitution, and they drew up codes that restricted black freedom. They knew they could not draw up a slave constitution like they'd done before. So what they did was they drew up codes that restricted black freedom. None of the states gave blacks the right to vote. Now I'm talking about the 11 southern states that left the Union. Florida, Georgia, North, South Carolina, Tennessee. Alabama, Mississippi, Arkansas, Louisiana, Texas. These states that left the Union drew up their own constitutions, but they drew up restrictive laws called black codes, which greatly limited the amount of freedom that blacks had. Johnson believed in states' rights, so he did not intervene. He said, well, let them draw up their own laws. That's okay, as long as they don't draw up slavery, but that's been outlawed. But otherwise, let them draw up their own laws. The southern states sent some high-ranking Confederates to Washington to be their senators and representatives, but the people in Washington, the northern congressmen, the northern senators, refused to admit them. Now later on they did, but at first they refused to admit these former slave owners and these people who had borne arms against the United States. They said, the Congress said, no one who has borne arms against the United States may serve in high office. No one who has borne arms against the United States will be considered citizens. They changed that later, but Southerners, moderate and extreme Republicans both joined to oppose Southern Reconstruction. Congress and the President then were at odds. Congress passed laws that said that Southern states had to comply with their terms, the Congress's terms. The first such law that was passed was vetoed. Now, up until this time, no major legislation that a president vetoed had ever been passed over a president's veto. The Congress had been too divided. But this time, the Congress was without the 11 rebellious southern states, which meant the Congress was more united than ever. So Congress vetoed the first law that restricted southern states, but the Republicans became more united, seeing they had to. They passed more laws. Johnson vetoed them. In fact, Johnson vetoed more laws than most presidents before him ever had. And for the first time in American history, his vetoes were overridden. Major legislation passed over a president's veto. Again, that's because both the House and Senate had the 2/3 vote that they needed. Now, Congress passed the 14th Amendment. Here are the 3 amendments. I mean, we had to learn this when I was in school. 3 amendments that were passed after the Civil War. I mean, well, the 13th was passed while the Civil War was still going on. The 13th Amendment freed the slaves. The 14th made them citizens. And then if that weren't enough, the 15th gave them the right to vote. Anyway, Congress not only passed the 14th Amendment to make citizens out of former slaves, but they said that southern states would have to accept the 14th Amendment in order to be admitted back into the Union. This law stayed on the books. So every southern state that was readmitted, and they all were, at least on paper, accepted the 14th Amendment. But meanwhile, women were trying to get the 14th Amendment to be worded to say not only were black people citizens, but women had the right to vote also. They wanted the wording changed just a little bit. The women were ignored. It was to be about 50 more years, you have 53 or actually about 55 years before women actually voted. Tennessee accepted the 14th Amendment. If you study the history of Tennessee, and I lived in Tennessee for 8 years, they did not have as many plantations as they did in the other parts of the Deep South. They were not as, in fact, Johnson himself was a Tennessean. Tennessee accepted the 14th Amendment. Tennessee came back to the Union. Well, Andrew Johnson wrote letters to the other states telling them reject the amendment. Violence against blacks escalated. Blacks were intimidated. Now, during the time of the early part of the Reconstruction, a lot of black people served in the state legislatures, and at least two black men went to the Senate, and some others went to Congress. And but this only lasted for a short time. And eventually the black people were intimidated from holding office and even intimidated from voting. Well, in 1866, 1 year after the Civil War, about almost 2 years, the election occurred in November. The war ended in April 1865. In 1866, in November, people voted in a Congress that was more radical than ever. Keep in mind, 10 of the states were not allowed to vote. So a lot of the northern people wanted the South to be punished. I mean, they said, hey, they killed my father, they killed my husband, they killed my son. And they wanted the South to be punished. They also wanted changes made in the South. A more radical than ever Congress appeared on the scene. They imposed military rule over the South, except for Tennessee, which played along with their game. Again, Congress gave blacks the ballot, but not land, and blacks felt like, hey, without land, what good is the ballot to us? And but they were not given land. In the meantime, Johnson doing what he could. I mean, he had to, you may know, presidents have the right to issue pardons. He issued pardons to Southerners. This upset people quite a bit. Now, I want to go into detail about impeachment, more so than I have on my notes. I want to go into more detail because this is an issue going on right now. The law that Johnson violated, Congress passed the Tenure of Office Act. Now, the Tenure of Office Act said that the president could not fire a member of the executive branch of government. Now, folks, this is a right that's been available to every president, but they took that from Johnson. Johnson vetoed it, but again, the Congress is more united than ever. They passed it over Johnson's veto. That everyone now, I want to remind you, the president cannot fire a congressman, he cannot fire a senator, he cannot fire a congressman's helper, he cannot fire a congressman's page, he cannot fire anyone who works for a senator secretary, but he can fire people in the executive branch. He can dismiss the Secretary of State, he can dismiss the Secretary of Defense, and he can dismiss the FBI director, and our present president has done a lot of that. But anyway, yes, you did.
Thank you.
You're welcome. I know how you must have felt.
Yeah, I know. Sorry.
Okay. I saw it and left it alone, but she left her phone here anyway. Believe it or not, I did it on last Wednesday myself. So. All right. Tell you something about that phone. It's the same color as the desk, and it blends in so well. If my computer hadn't bumped into it, I wouldn't have noticed it. All right. So much for that. That's off the subject. Anyway, all right. Now, anyway, the 15th. Well, let's see. We've been jumping around the story. Johnson. Well, there was a member of Johnson's cabinet. Now, the Tenure of Office Act had not specified that Johnson was not allowed to dismiss a cabinet member. Nevertheless, there was a member of Johnson's cabinet who was a spy for Congress, and he was telling Congress everything that Johnson said in the cabinet meetings. Johnson found out about him, and to make a long story short, Johnson dismissed that cabinet member, which again, every president has the right to do. Some people in Congress said, foul, he broke the law. They charged him with high crimes and misdemeanors. All right, now, I want to make something clear about impeachment. This you need to know, especially right now. The word impeach means the House of Representatives votes to impeach, votes articles of impeachment. It does not mean the president is removed from office. To be removed from office, 2/3, now the House, if the House has a majority, then he's impeached. The majority of people vote to he's impeached. but 2/3 of the Senate has to vote to remove him from office. No president has ever been removed from office by way of impeachment. Now, we've only had 2 presidents that were impeached as of this moment. Those 2 were Andrew Johnson and Bill Clinton. And in both cases, the vote was purely political. It had nothing to do with whether the men were guilty of a crime or not. It was purely a political vote. In the case of Bill Clinton, it was almost every Republican voted to impeach, and every Democrat in the South, every Democrat in the House voted not to impeach. Then it went to the Senate. The Republicans had a majority, so he was impeached. It went to the Senate, and a majority of senators voted to remove him from office. A majority, but it was not 2/3. So William Jefferson Clinton stayed in office. In the case of Johnson, he did not, he survived only 1 vote. If 1 senator who voted to acquit had voted to impeach, Andrew Johnson would have been removed from office. Now, I want to say this about Johnson. He was fiery tempered. He was been governor of Tennessee, where that he could get away with stuff like that. But in Washington, he was expected to appear more presidential. He was fiery, he was sharp-tongued. But he finally got a team of lawyers around and said, "Mr. Johnson, will you please just be quiet? Let us do your talking for you." Johnson remained quiet, said nothing. His lawyers did his talking for him. If Johnson would have opened his mouth, he might have been removed from office. And folks, again, I don't want to take side, but at the present moment, we have a president who is sharp-tongued also, and capable of saying things that he shouldn't say. And if he'd keep quiet, it's more. All right, that's all I want to say about that. All of you think know what I'm talking about. Again, our present president, there's serious talk about impeachment. The last I heard of that this morning was Speaker of the House decided not to bring it to a vote right now on the House floor, which surprised a lot of folk. Here's what is risky about impeachment. When the Republicans tried to impeach Bill Clinton, it backfired on them. And in the case of Johnson, the people who voted to impeach Johnson, most of them were turned out of office in the next election. Johnson was himself sent back to the Senate about 6 years or so later, and when he got to the Senate, he found that hardly anyone who had voted for his impeachment was still left in the Senate. So it's an issue that can backfire on the persons who try it. A lot of persons also were afraid if Johnson had been removed from office, a parliamentary government might have resulted to where when the people decided they didn't like a president, they could simply vote impeachment and remove him from office. But instead, it's proven really, really difficult to impeach a president. Now, you might ask, what about Richard Nixon? Richard Nixon knew he had 34 votes in the Senate. He was not going to be removed from office until the last minute. When the Supreme Court ruled he had to turn over some tapes, he turned over the tapes, and the tapes showed that he had been involved in the cover-up. And what they got at Nixon was a cover-up, not the break-in. The break-in, we don't know if Nixon ever had anything to do with that or not. He died saying he never knew about it. He might not have. But it was the cover-up that got him. He covered up, they called it obstruction of justice and abuse of power. When the tapes showed that he had been involved in a cover-up, in spite of the fact he said he hadn't, but he had been involved from day 3 after the break-in, at least, maybe even sooner than that. And at that point, Nixon realized he didn't even have anywhere, he didn't have 15 votes in the Senate. Republican and Democrat alike turned against him. Senator Barry Goldwater visited and said, "Mr. Nixon, we can't support you anymore." And rather than go through the impeachment process, Nixon resigned. He would have been turned out of office if it had come to a vote, but he resigned, saving the country and himself a lot of trouble. But again, it's difficult. Now, there was a case in Illinois where Governor Blagojevich of Illinois received $1 million to appoint a certain man to Barack Obama's Senate seat after Barack Obama was elected president. And of course, Barack Obama had to resign his Senate seat. And the governor of Illinois received a big sum of money for appointing a certain man. He was caught. The Illinois House voted 100% to impeach him, went to the Senate. The Illinois Senate voted 100% to impeach him, and Governor Blackwell-Bridge was removed from office. Anyway, but impeachment has been very, very rarely used in this country. I think there's only been maybe one or two federal judges who were impeached, two presidents who were impeached, none of them removed from office by impeachment. Anyway, at least one of the senators who voted to acquit was called all kinds of dirty names, and he never got back in the Senate. His political career was dead. And John Kennedy wrote a book, Profiles in Courage, about the incident. His name was Ross, how that Mr. Ross simply would not go along with the idea of removal from office because he didn't believe that Johnson was guilty, even though the trial was political. In the case of Johnson, there was no vice president in those days. Johnson had been vice president himself, so there was no vice president. The president of the Senate would become president if Johnson were removed from office. He voted to impeach. It was a tough league in those days. Now, the 15th Amendment was passed. Oh yeah, Johnson called for a truce. He spent the last 10 months of his office letting Congress have its way. He made no attempt, his power was broken, his influence was broken. He knew that there was no limit to how much he could be impeached again. I mean, it's not like anyone else where that if they tried and couldn't convict you the first time, they can't try you again. But for the president, if they don't convict him the first time, they can always try again. So Johnson called for truce. 15th Amendment, again, gave blacks the right to vote. Women spoke up and said, hey, let's make this change, just a few words in that amendment to include on account of sex also. This was not done. Again, the country was not ready for that. All right. Blacks in those days almost always registered as Republicans, and this was remaining true for few generations. Now, today, most blacks will register as Democrats. Again, each of you can decide for yourself why that is. But in those days, most blacks, almost all black men registered as Republicans. Carpetbaggers were Northerners who moved from the North to South because Southerners at this time who had taken up arms against the country were not allowed to hold office. So these carpetbaggers, they were called that because most of them were so poor that they put all their belongings on a stick and wrapped the carpet bag around a stick, and that's where they had all their belongings, and they would go south carrying their stick over their shoulder with their few belongings inside the carpet bag. They were called carpetbaggers. There's another term for Southerners who had not fought in the Civil War and were eligible to run for office. They were called scalawags. But I'm not going to write that down. But scalawags were Southerners who had not fought on the side of the South. But only these scalawags and carpetbaggers were allowed to hold office at first, and a lot of blacks held office. But then a new organization came in, the Ku Klux Klan. Now, I'm going to give a little bit of brief history of the Klan. The Klan was strong in the late 1860s and early 1870s. Then it died away for a while. Then it became really strong again in the 1920s. Then it died down. By the 1930s, the country had its mind on depression more than anything else. But then in the 1960s, when I was in high school, it came back strong again. I had a couple of classmates who had thought about joining. The mechanic my dad went to thought about joining. My dad did not believe in the Klan, so he did not join. My wife found out that one of her grandfathers, she was never told this by her mother, but she found out by doing some family research that one of her grandfathers was a member of the Ku Klux Klan. And a lot of you, if you're Southern, some of your ancestors also might have been, if you're Southern and you're white, if you're Southern and white, some of your ancestors might have been members of the Klan. Southern states, though, began to realize that they had Johnson, could not help them anymore. His power was broken. It was all Congress now. Congress had all the power for the federal government. So they accepted the 14th Amendment. They did not accept the 15th necessarily, even though when they came back in the Union, they understood the Constitution is in force.